So, welcome. Moving on here in Jude. Obviously, the previous two lessons. First lesson was the introductory lesson. Last week, the introductory lesson kind of very briefly covered verses 1 and 2, as well as the general context of the book and who Jude, or aka Judas, is in this case, the Apostle Jude. Last week's lesson was the first where we got into more of the substance of the text itself. We looked at verses 3 and 4, which concludes the opening introduction, pardon the redundancy, verses 3 and 4. So what we saw there primarily last week, to refresh your memory, was the purpose of the actual letter of the epistle, which is verse 3, especially that latter portion. I felt it necessary to write to you, exhorting that you contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all handed down to the saints. Because of verse 4, for certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who were long beforehand marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. What we explained in the bedrock we laid there is that who this is referring to is it's the same group or crowd of people that the Apostle Peter is referring to in 2 Peter, which is in this broader area of not just Judea but Samaria up to Antioch, right? Those who are Gnostics, who hold to a particular view which we call in Christian theology antinomianism, okay? From the root Greek word nomos, meaning law, okay? The equivalent of the Latin lex, where we get the English word law from. So they reject the law of God. Again, we talked a bit about different Gnostic groups and why this was the case, particularly one of the earliest of the Gnostic cults, which was the heresy of Marcionism, named after Marcion of Sinope, its founder, which rejected the Old Testament essentially in its entirety. Okay, and of course that's where the law is rooted, right? There's plenty of law in the New Testament, but the law is rooted in the Old Testament, obviously. And so naturally it follows you reject the Old Testament, you reject the law of God therein, etc., right? So Gnosticism is the context of this book, particularly the antinomian variety, okay? We handed out structures for that last week. Remind me who was here last week? You here? Yeah, you here? Kings wasn't, that's right, you weren't either. Let me just grab a copy sheet. And if you've still got the copy, I can bring you a thing here. What we're onto here for, and I'll grab you a copy sheet. Yes, that's it there. Good. Cool. Yep. Yeah, it's Jude, yeah. That's it. So, what you'll note on that is then the various other subdivisions of the text, right? So, essentially the main bulk, which is what we're into now, right, of the letter is verses 5 to 19, okay? So verses 5 to 19 is ultimately the main body of the text. We're going to subdivide that down across a number of weeks here, obviously, to fill in the time, and because we're ultimately wanting to subdivide the whole book into 6 textual lessons plus the introduction that we had at the beginning for the 7 lessons that we have on this book, right?
So we're doing all that?
No, not all today. No, I'm not doing all today. No, we're subdividing. I'm just explaining. Yes, we'll be here till probably beyond midnight. No, today what we're covering specifically is verses 5 to 7. Okay, so 5, 6, and 7. But to understand what the structure of the main body is, from verses 5 to 19, there is essentially 2 triads that are given, 2 lots of 3, and he uses 3 different examples, okay, that highlight this kind of rebellion that is going on in verse 4, okay, the kind of infiltration by enemies of God into the church, those who are sowing division and rebellion, okay, particularly against his law, which is that whole Gnostic aspect that we touched on in verse 4 last week. First 3 are found in essentially verses 5 to 10. It's really verses 5, 6, and 7, which is what we're covering today. And then verses 8, 9, and 10, he gives a kind of bonus example, so to speak, okay? So we're going to be looking at the first of these triads, which is verses 5 through 7 today, okay? He then gives 3 more examples in verses 11 through 13. That will be 2 lessons from now. And then further expounds upon that from 14 to 19. Anyway, that's the basic breakdown of the body of it, okay? So we're covering the first of these triads, okay? The first of these group of 3 that's given, right? And the purpose of it is to give examples of rebellion from the Old Testament world. It's not exclusively the Old Testament text, because he actually references a story from First Enoch. We explained in the introduction that there's 2 extra biblical references in this book. It's extra biblical, in other words, outside the Bible. Namely from a book called First Enoch, written about 200 to 300 years prior to the time of Christ and the apostles here, as well as another book called the Testament of Moses, which is a kind of Hebrew folk story of the latter years of Moses' life, and it parallels broadly with the ending of the book of Deuteronomy, particularly chapter 33 and 32 and 33 of Deuteronomy. So he references 2 well-known stories from that, because as we mentioned in the introduction, the audience here primarily is in this Judea, Samaria, Syria region, right, of the ancient Near Eastern world, okay? So he's not speaking to a primarily Greek audience or a Roman audience, for example. He's speaking to a primarily Hebrew audience, okay, who are very familiar with these cultural stories. It would be like if we reference things that are part of our popular culture in Australian culture or British culture or whatever it happens to be, right? And so by referencing these, he is using familiar examples that the audience will have naturally known throughout their life anyway, growing up with these stories, to draw example by way of comparison to what the Nicolaitans, who are the primary group ultimately, I know they're not mentioned here, but a group like the Nicolaitans, an early Gnostic cult, who are antinomian, who reject the law of God, who reject the things that come with that, particularly around idolatry and sexual ethics, etc., etc. Hence the reference in verse 4 to sensuality and denial of our Lord and Master. Using these examples to get the point across, okay? The final piece of this puzzle, to understand the difference between the first and second triad in this middle body, in the main body of this letter. The first triad, which is what we're looking at today directly, is examples of rebellion that result in destruction or condemnation, okay? That reap chaotic consequences upon not only the generation or the people that do it, right, or those in view, that's more what's intended here, but it has follow-on effects, especially in regards to the abandonment of order, or the breakdown of order, we could say, and lasting repercussions that then pass on through generation to generation, especially tying this concept of sensuality, right? The second triad is primarily focused upon similar kind of thing, but it's mainly upon those who corrupted others to do evil, okay? So even if you glance very briefly down to verse 11, you'll see one of the earliest figures of that kind mentioned, Cain, okay, in verse 11, right? So he's attacking this from 2 different angles to achieve the same objective. One is this first triad, 5 to 7, with the bonus example of verses 8 to 10, of rebellion that brings judgment / destruction, including upon the rest of the people, right? And then the second triad is corrupting influences among the people that has lasting, ongoing kind of outward corruption, right? It should be obvious, hopefully, even from that brief explanation, why he would be doing this in relation to warning the audience against those who are attempting to infiltrate and corrupt the church from within, right? The connection should be fairly obvious, at least immediately. But we'll have that unpacked in much greater detail as we go through. So, Elements of this you'll be familiar with, especially because the first portion that we actually touch on, the very first example he gives, is the rebellion of Korah, okay, which is one of the things that we've touched on in Deuteronomy, okay, many times obviously. So it's going back to Moses' time, right? The others you may not be familiar with. We're not going to literally read through all the portion of First Enoch that discusses this, because it's about 3 chapters worth of content, or really more than that, but at least 3 direct chapters worth of content, right? So we're not going to read through every single part of it, but I will explain to you what the synopsis of that portion of that book is, so that you at least understand what's being talked about, with the caveat, which we'll get to. So let's begin in verse 5 of Jude. Jude verses 5 to 7. Now I want to remind you, though you know all things, that Jesus, having once saved a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And angels, who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, having indulged in the same way as these in gross sexual immorality, and having gone after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so verse 5. Right, you can see the 3 examples there. The 3 examples that are given are, the rebellion of Korah directly, but really there's multiple rebellions that go on in the wilderness, right? So the rebellions, plural, of the Exodus generation, as we call them in shorthand, okay? The parents/grandparents of those to whom Deuteronomy is written, because Deuteronomy is written to to a series of speeches, but written in the time of, and referring to the time of, the new generation under Joshua and Caleb, the successors of Moses, who would then actually begin the conquest of Canaan. Right? Second example is a complex one, and this is what's directly referring to First Enoch, the angels who did not keep their own domain. Right? And then the third is the rebellious ancient cities of Sodom, the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, okay, from Abraham's time, right, in Genesis. So one reference really from Exodus, another from First Enoch, broadly working on things from Genesis 6, and then Genesis, 13, 14 plus, right? The story of Abraham, long story short, okay? Let's begin in verse 5. Now, I want to remind you, so again, that word reminder, this is why I explained in the introduction, spent that time to explain. This is him giving examples that, by way of comparison, to help them understand the point of why he's writing this letter. Okay? He's recalling to them familiar stories. That's why he says, now I want to remind you. Though you know all things, we shouldn't assume that to mean that he's calling them omniscient. He's saying, I know that you know these stories, right? That's essentially the essence of what he's saying, right? I'm going to remind you of them. Right? That Jesus, having once saved a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. Okay? Multiple things here. Let's just begin sequentially in order. Right? First off is the identification that it is Jesus who is the God who saved the Israelites out of Egypt. Okay? This is why, in passing at times, in whatever settings, in sermons or questions, whatever, I've explained that the voice that appears in the burning bush is Christ, okay, is Jesus. The angel of the Lord who went forth in the cloud of pillar, in the pillar of cloud and of fire by day and night, respectively, is Christ. Okay? The God who Moses met with upon Mount Sinai is Christ. Right? That is the consistent testimony of the New Testament, including very directly and evidently here in Jude. Okay? Jude is explicitly identifying that it is Jesus who saved the people out of the land of Egypt. Okay? He is the eternal Logos, the Word of God, made flesh. Hence why he says in the Gospels that if to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and others, to the Jews who did not believe him, that if they truly believed Moses, they would believe me also. Why? Because everything that Moses ever heard and saw was because of me in the first place. I'm the one who said these things to Moses, right? When Moses would come down from Mount Sinai and give the law, I am the one who gave him that law. Right? When he would give the command of the Lord, right? I am the Lord that gave that command. That's the essence and that's the point. Right? And so Jesus is explicitly identified as the one who saved the people out of the land of Egypt. Okay, he is that the one and the same God, right? Which automatically, by the way, is a polemic against Marcionism, which we referenced last week. Okay, as one of the early Gnostic cults, right? Marcionism hasn't developed by this point, right? But it lays the groundwork for it, right? Marcionism would arise in about another 50 to 100 years, roughly speaking, about 50 years, another 50 years approximately, like 50, yeah, early 2nd century. But here the groundwork against Marcionism is already, because the seeds of what becomes Marcionism, which is just another Gnostic variant, are already present in the earliest proto-forms of Gnosticism here already, which is rejection of the material, total obeisance to the spiritual, and all the things that eventually go into that hyper form, which is Marcionism, which is just one of the many variants, as I said last week. Right? Marcion's belief and other Gnostic groups, other Gnostic cults that shared that view to one degree or another, which believed that the Old Testament God is an evil demiurge and that the New Testament God, Jesus, is a different God, a separate deity, is directly refuted by this. Because here, he is identified as the one who saved the people out of the land of Egypt. They can't be two different gods. They're the one God. Right? Yet also, he is the one who is, as you can read literally and figuratively subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. Okay. So here, the same Lord, the same God, Jesus, who saved the Israelites out of Egypt, destroyed them in judgment when they did not believe. In other words, literally did not have faith. Okay, that's why we've explained as we've gone through every now and then as we've gone through Deuteronomy, the whole purpose of that book, right? Warning the new younger generation: do not go the way of your parents, but rather go the way of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Faith, right? As opposed to apostasy of their parents, right? That generation rebelled, which is why the 40 years of wandering was even incurred anyway. That was part of the judgment. So they were judged in this world and they're judged in the next world. Right? Judgments happen in both. Judgment is not just something that happens on the day of judgment, which is referenced later on in verse 6. That does happen there, right? But judgment also occurs temporally here in this world as well, right? Chaotic, evil things will be judged, and they are also in themselves a judgment, right, for apostasy, and for foolishness and for idolatry, blah, blah, blah. First example, right? The Exodus generation, who ultimately rebel multiple times. They rebel with the golden calf, the rebellion of Korah, which is led by elements of the Levites, right, the priesthood. Multiple rebellions, and they were destroyed for it, right? And they're damned for that lack of faith. Okay, so that's action consequence that's setting up this whole paradigm of this first triad. Okay, they did not believe, they did not have faith, literally. They rejected the God who saved them out of the land of Egypt, right? And therefore they are rejected by that God who saved them out of the land of Egypt. Nothing terribly complex beyond that, right? We could sit there and go all the way through Exodus if we wanted to, but we know we're up on, generally speaking, what that account is, right? That settles that, right? First example. Second example, which we're going to spend much more time, right? I'm not trying to rush to the first example. There's nothing terribly complex in the first example, okay? Other than the clear, important point, which is identifying that Jesus is the God who saved them out of Egypt, right? That's an extremely important point just in general Christian terms for understanding the nature of the Old Testament, for understanding how it relates to the New Testament, and vice versa, I suppose, and then understanding who Christ is. Okay, but nevertheless, the second example, which is where we get into the reference to First Enoch, pardon me, right? So verse 6. And, second example, angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So what on earth is that referring to? Part of this will be better addressed in one. I do have a question directly, very literally related to this exact subject in the Q&A. Not this coming Sunday, but one of the other Sundays. Although actually in part one of your questions in regards to angels does actually kind of touch on this. So I will in part be answering some of it today, and I expect there'll be a flow over to Sunday. But the predominance of it I will leave for the better setting of that Q&A where I can directly address the specifics of the subject, right? First off, let's understand what on earth is it even referring to. So in First Enoch, again, primarily chapters 6 to 8, right? The book of Enoch at large, there's multiple books of Enoch, but First Enoch itself, which is the first of them, is subdivided into shorter, we call them books, but they're more like subsections, okay? Shorter books. It's almost like an amalgamation of different short books, a couple of chapters long, right? The first, the opening of them, which is where this portion is found, and the latter portion, chapter 6 to 8, is called the Book of the Watchers. Okay, Watchers, W-A, as in watch, but with E-R-S. Yes, Watchers, W-A-T-C-H-E-R-S, Watchers, right? Someone who watches. Right? It's taking upon, the reason why it's called that is, and this word watcher is playing on a word coming from the Greek, ultimately, that is used to describe in ancient times certain types of angelic beings. Okay, again, we're delving into cultural elements that people would have been immediately familiar with here. Long story short, what First Enoch describes is it basically takes portions of Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4, which we'll read on just in a second, and then expounds it and explain. It's almost like taking the root story, which is really only 4 verses, not long at all, right? And then diving into an entire expose, so to speak, of what on earth this is actually talking about. Some of the complications of that we'll get onto in a minute, but let's at least first understand what on earth this is referring to. So turn with me to Genesis 6. Okay? All the way back to the beginning of the Bible, chapter 6. Now, obviously, creation, chapter 1 / beginning of 2, or really throughout chapter 2, the fall, chapter 3, Cain and Abel, chapter 4, and the following from that, chapter 5, blah, blah, blah. And then you arrive in chapter 6, okay? This is building up to basically to the story of Noah that follows on from this, kind of really chapters 6 through 9, essentially, right? But at the beginning of chapter 6 in Genesis, here's what we read, right? The first 4 verses. Now it happened that when men began to multiply on the face of the land, right? So humanity grew larger and larger, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good in appearance, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive, in other words, walk, literally walk, shall not walk with man forever, because he indeed is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, here's where this gets both interesting and very, very, very detailed. Right? I can't stress enough how complex this subject gets, right? At least in terms of theology and history and historiography and literary history and everything else. This is basically a paragraph, literally and figuratively. right? It's not a great expansive amount of detail. That in ancient times, the Israelites really didn't need much more than a paragraph to explain what this was actually talking about. Again, they were deeply familiar with this, as were all peoples generally speaking in the ancient world. Right? I'll talk about that in a second. We, however, have the chasm of time to traverse and a considerable disconnect between context of immediate understanding versus secondary or tertiary understandings, right, that come second-hand or third-hand, as I say. As a result, there are a variety of views in Christianity, not just today, but actually historically, as to what on earth this is talking about. Okay, the two main elements of this that need to be understood is what gets referred to as, it's mainly in verse 2, the sons of God and daughters of men. Okay, because the rest of the story is built around that. There's then obviously a third figure or category, 3/4, depending on how you interpret the sons of God. But anyway, the Nephilim, which means mighty one, right, in its literal sense, more loosely translated as giant, but not literally. That most people will be familiar with that term if they've been in church for a while, right? A variety of understandings as to what this is talking about, okay? Let's unpack that subject first so that we can then circle back to what Jude is probably communicating, okay? Because otherwise it'd be cart before the horse, right? There are three broad understandings. One of them, or two of them, are pretty closely related, depending on who you talk to, but three at least broad categories. Two main distinct ones, though, okay, as to how this has ever been understood or interpreted, right? One we simply call the angelic/watchers view, which is where that term's coming from First Enoch, okay? The second is called the Sethite view, right, relating back to Seth, okay, as in the other brother, successor after Abel, yep. So go back to chapter 4, right, a couple of chapters prior to this, okay. First of these, angelic/watchers, okay, is the view that sons of God here, the term in Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, which just literally means the sons of God, right? The Huioi Tomtheon, the sons of God, which is what it would be in Greek, is a reference to angels, okay, to angelic beings. Okay? That view has pretty considerable Old Testament precedent. There's a variety of places throughout the Old Testament where that exact phrase, Huioi Tomtheon or B'nai Elohim, refers to angels explicitly. Job is one such place. There's a couple of Psalms that do it as well. Other places in Exodus, and a couple of other more obscure references as well. But anyway, you get the picture. There's a number of references in some of the oldest texts as well, especially places like Job. Job is written and collated around the time of the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, but it's the oldest chronological story in essence, right? In some of its writing, because Job predates Moses, right? And so you have these references directly of that exact phrase which is used here in verse 2, the sons of God. Elsewhere in Scripture, very clearly and directly referring or alluding to angelic beings. Okay. And so the essence of that view, to give you the synopsis of what First Enoch describes, he explicitly describes, well, it's not he, the author of First Enoch, okay, who is attributing that writing or that tradition to Enoch, the 7th generation from Adam, okay, so one of the great, insert how many greats, grandsons of Adam, explains in short that it was 200 angels who rebelled and sided with Satan in the Great Rebellion in heaven. They then meet upon the earth, and they then, from that subsequent point, there's a whole bunch of filler detail which is not relevant to us in this context. But in short, they, having already been appointed as rulers over the world in various different nations, and it's tying back to things in this case later on in Genesis 11, what's called the Table of Nations. Right? If you're not familiar with that, what that is, in chapter 11, this is after the days of the Tower of Babel, right? Just before the Tower of Babel, I should say. And you have there described in chapter 10 into chapter 11 the 70 nations that arise after the days of Noah. Right? Noah has his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From them, children, children's children, blah, 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 blah. And there's 70 nations or people groups which arise in what we call the ancient Near Eastern world. Okay? In one form or another, the peoples of the world are descended from those 70 nations, right? A lot of that's fairly well established archaeologically. From there, you get spread out. And so that's why we have, again, like places like Mesopotamia, so places like ancient Sumeria, Arcadia, Babylon, that whole area, Assyria, across to the land of Canaan. It's called the Fertile Crescent. Okay, it's this great arch around the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. Early other major civilizations like Mitzrayim, in other words, Egypt, okay, along the River Nile, the Indus Valley civilization, so India, Pakistan, across over to the Yangtze in China, right? Early civilizations established very early on, those three or those four, right, that are arising in the ancient, what we call the ancient Near Eastern world, and expanding out from there, right? What is explained in First Enoch by the author of First Enoch is that clearly the common understanding among the Hellenistic Jews, the Hebrews there, in the centuries prior to Christ in that culture, was that these sons of God are those who are of the angelic host that we hear of all the time in the Old Testament, right? Hence why God's called the Lord of Hosts. Hosts is another name for army, right? The armies of heaven. And he had appointed his angels, servants, to administer and govern the affairs of those nations. Okay, that's actually a very well established, or pretty well established concept in the Old Testament anyway, right? We see that in a variety of places, particularly places like Psalm 82, right? Although there are disagreements as to what that means based on how you read this. Like I'm saying, you're going to hear me a lot. Just see if I can pause for 1 second and explain this for about 30 seconds, hopefully. You're going to hear me, it might sound like I'm being very non-committal today. It's not because of that. I have my view on what I think this stuff is. But it's because this is actually a surprisingly complex subject that requires a really sophisticated knowledge of texts spanning across about the last 2,300 years. So I don't mean text only going back to 2,300 years ago. I mean all across the last 2,300 years. How this has been understood and interpreted by some of the largest and most prominent philosophers, historians, theologians, etc., across the last 2,300 years since the days the first Enoch was actually written, right? It requires a serious working knowledge to actually have a full encompassed picture of what that is, which has taken me bomb loads of time to actually be able to do. So I can't just regurgitate that into a single Bible study, right? However, to finish off the angelic view, the essential view is that those rebellious angels who sided with Satan against God then mated or procreated, however you'd like to describe it, with human women, hence daughters of men. Okay? Sons of God versus angels, daughters of men, humans. Now, this is something which is very reflective of ancient pagan mythology, very, very, very reflective of that, including the rest of it, which follows through to verse 4, right? Nephilim, right? Mighty warriors or giants, right? Is something which is, in every literal sense, ubiquitous, universal in ancient pagan mythologies. It quite literally does not matter where you go. You can pick anyone you want. You can pick figures like... So, for example, the Greek pantheon, the Greek mythologies are replete with this. Zeus, right, the divine king, the king of the gods, transforms himself into all manner of figures to, essentially what we would describe as rape human women. and then produce a demigod figure of one kind or another as a result, right? Or even just another god, right? Or some of the great heroes, right? This kind of concept of divine / angelic, I'll use that term synonymously here for simplicity's sake, one divine parent, one human parent, is exactly where the concept of a demigod even comes from. Demigod meaning half god, right? All the great Greek heroes, right? We get the English word hero literally from the Greek heros, hero, right? Hercules, or Heracles in Greek. Achilles, right? The son of the human king Peleus, and his mother, who was a water nymph, in other words, a sea goddess. Okay, you get this image all the time in Greek mythology. You get it all the time elsewhere in Egyptian mythology, Babylonian mythology. The consummation of one divine / angelic progenitor and a human progenitor all over the place, right? And it produces, as a result of that, a synonymous concept of mighty ruler, a warrior, a king, a giant. This is all kind of just blended together. And so all these kinds of examples that could be brought up from history, if I go back to where we were in Genesis, there we go. All these kinds of examples that could be brought up of that are like this. Bran the Blessed, who a giant king in British mythology, ancient British mythology, the founding kings of the Mesoamerican cities, so Mesoamerica like Mexico, like pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, all the great ancient cities were founded by giants. Tenochtitlan, where the great pyramid of Tenochtitlan, the largest pyramid in the world, is, right, or was. Teotihuacan, which was even more significant than that, was founded by the race of giants, right? The name of that city in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican language literally means the city where men become gods. Okay, and the explanation that everyone ubiquitously held to in pre-Aztec and Aztec culture was that these gigantic pyramids were built by giants. That's how they were so large, right? Is it Fang Feng in Chinese mythology, I believe, as well, ancient Chinese mythology. In the days of some of the ancient founding kings, going all the way back to the first dynasties 4,000 years ago. There's all kinds. No matter where you go to, quite literally, even here in Australia, various different legends among the Aboriginals of giants all over the place. Usually cannibalistic in these stories here. There's no corner of the earth that you can go to in any pagan mythology anywhere on earth where there is not divine beings, and I'm putting angelic under that category, having some legendary relationship with mortal, usually women, but not always. It sometimes goes the other way around. Like Achilles was the opposite way around, human father, divine mother, right? But generally speaking, one or the other, right? And producing this synonymous concept of a warrior, a king, a giant, or all the above, right? It's literally ubiquitous. And all of it happens in the days after the other common element which every single one of these pagan mythologies has, which is a flood.
Yeah, the flood story.
Right, every one of them, right? I mentioned one such figure earlier, from ancient Chinese mythology of Fang Feng. That's happening literally in the aftermath of the Great Flood. Okay, and in the days, and again, some of the founding kings of the early dynasties, right? Even pre-imperial, 4,000 years ago. And so these examples are all following the same exact broad plot line, right? Of divine progenitor mixing with human progenitor, producing mighty warrior, king, giant, et al. Great flood occurring, all these kinds of elements, right? Which is exactly the synopsis of what is a rather short and terse passage of verses 1 to 4 in Genesis 6. Okay? Nephilim on the earth in those days and also afterward. If you wanted to get more into that specifically, that would require a specific lesson. I think I'll at least answer that more directly in one of the questions that was asked. Mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Mighty men literally is El Gibor, great, which means the warrior, right, or the mighty warrior, same thing. So mighty men literally means a warrior. We just translate that way in English, right? That is the short version of of how this works. The angelic / watcher view is that sons of God, B'nai Elohim, is a direct reference to angelic powers or beings who, through one form or another, procreate with human women. It produces this group of offspring, this godless monstrosity of a hybrid called the Nephilim, who were demonic, gigantic, powerful, etc. Primarily destroyed in the flood, albeit not totally. That's for more complex reasons that come into play later on. And that's what's being referred to in, of course, what we have in Jude 6, right? The angels who did not keep their own domain but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. What that's explicitly referring to give you, in terms of the latter portion, in terms of how this is reading, if we're taking the angelic / watcher view, is in relation to something that would be true regardless of what view you take, quite frankly, on Genesis 6, which is that what he's touching on here is what was, again, ubiquitously understood, which is that the place that the Greeks called Tartaros, what we call hell in English, ultimately from the Norse word, the Scandinavian, the Viking word, hell, H-E-L, right? The place of evil and judgment, right? Which we ironically think of fire when the Scandinavians, it was actually a place of ice and darkness, playing into that concept of darkness there. That those who fell, the angels that fell, were judged by God and were ultimately imprisoned in Tartaros. That's, again, also another concept, that is deeply reflected in ancient pagan mythologies almost all over. Almost every, or at least the major ones, of ancient pagan mythologies, especially the Greeks, but others as well, have some kind of war in the heavens between an older generation of gods and a younger, newer generation of gods. Okay? So, seeing as I mentioned the Greeks, this is what's called the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. Okay? There's three main generations, two, but anyway, won't bore you with that. Long story short, the Titans, okay, who are the older generation, they had already rebelled against their parents anyway and overthrown their parents, and led by the king of that generation, Kronos, the god of time, which we're getting this word chronology from, had overthrown and rebelled against Uranos, his father, the heavens, right? And their mother, Gaia, the earth, okay, and their generation came from that. That generation then has children, right, a successive generation of God, who we call the Olympians, okay, because they resided upon Mount Olympus. This is Zeus and Poseidon and others, all the others, right? 12 main ones, but there's plenty of them others, right? They wage war against their predecessor generation and defeat them, and they then imprison the Titans in Tartaros. Okay? So you can see how this is a generation to generation to generation folklore passing down, stories getting corrupted and twisted and muddled and blah blah, of what actually occurs in the Bible anyway. Right? A war in the heavens, one side defeats the other gets imprisoned for obvious reasons. Okay? That's what that's dealing with. Okay? Right? All over the place. So the reason why I'm giving you this, doing this little exercise in what we call comparative religion, in other words, showing you how other religions compare to each other, is because The great irony of modern atheistic hubris in thinking that the biblical story is just hogwash, pie in the sky, silly old fables is the fact that you basically have to, if you take that kind of a sophomoric view, you end up having to conclude that quite literally everyone who ever lived prior to about 200 years ago was a complete idiot. And that for absolutely no reason whatsoever, they all happen to have the exact same elemental stories, just with cultural variance, right? Because it's difficult to understate to you how completely universal it is. Like I said to you, you will not find any broadly civilized culture of any meaningful development anywhere in the world in antiquity that does not have these elements, especially the flood thing, right? The ancient deluge. It's literally universal. From cultures who, after not all that long, had no meaningful knowledge that any of the others even existed anyway, right? So if you go back into ancient Babylonian records, they have no clue that the Chinese exist. And the Chinese have no clue that the Mesoamericans exist. And the Mesoamericans have no clue that the Babylonians exist. Because after you've been separated for that amount of time, geographically, as humanity migrated out after the flood, right? Even those who are more broadly linked, like the Amerindians, right? Who share closer genetic lineage with East Asians, right? Having migrated across the Bering Strait, okay, in ancient times, right, Alaska. They don't remember. It's not that long before all that migration and those stories and where they came from are long forgotten because it's just time. That should be obvious, right? And yet they still have the exact same elemental stories, right? So it's such clear to anyone with just general common sense. It's so obvious that these elements clearly happened, and every single culture around the world shares the seeds of those elemental stories, right? Now, let's explain the Sethite view, at least in brevity, or as much brevity as possible. Sethite view is the view that sons of God is not a reference to angelic or divine beings, right? But is a reference to the line of Seth that has already been playing out up to that point in the story, okay? So in 25 words or less, because we talk more about Cain in verse 11, because he gets referenced there, of course, as the beginning of the second triad, right? In verse 11 of Jude, I should say, sorry. Cain kills Abel. Cain is exiled and condemned to wander the earth, blah, blah, blah. Builds early cities, which is taken as a negative because there's a whole discourse as to why that's a problem in Genesis 4 and 5. Anyway, Adam and Eve then have another son, Seth. And Seth then becomes the continuation of the godly line, the faithful line, okay? Because Genesis 4 and 5, up to the point of chapter 6, is already playing out a dialectic. Dialectic, in other words, a twofold story, okay? You've got, through chapter 5 especially, but you've got playing out throughout from chapters 4 and 5, and the events of chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, these parallel genealogies that are bearing out from Adam onward, right? That are following the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain, okay? That's already playing on, pardon the pun, the seedling elements, the seminal elements, going back to Genesis 3 of the promise of redemption. Namely and specifically that the seed of the woman, seed means descendant, we should learn that, we should know that from our time in Galatians, right? The descendant of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, okay? Right? And you, the serpent, shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head, okay? So you will deliver a blow, he will deliver a fatal blow, right? And that ultimately comes to fulfillment in the cross, right? The serpent, Satan, kills Christ, but through that death, Christ then conquers death and defeats Satan once and for all, right? So, playing on this whole seed, this descendant, it's following a godly line, Seth, and an ungodly line, Cain, right? The faithful line, the unfaithful line, the godly line, the ungodly line, the righteous line, the wicked line, or the evil line, okay? Boom, 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 boom. And so Enoch, who is the eponymous attribution of first Enoch, obviously, is the one to whom they author, depending on scholarly views, but I won't bore you with that, the author at least of first Enoch, the book that's being referenced in Jude verse 6, that story and this explanation and all this stuff is being attributed to that Enoch. There's two Enochs, the righteous Enoch, I should say, okay? The Enoch from Seth's line, right? So basically the Sethite argument is that despite that ironic naming of first Enoch being attributed and the angelic view being attributed back to the line of Seth, the Sethite view is basically mounting the argument that, look, the context of chapters 4 and 5 is this dialectic playing out across history between the righteous line of Seth and the wicked line of Cain. And then you arrive in Genesis 6, right? Where now you get the mentioning of sons of God and daughters of men, right? And that the angelic or divine view completely and abruptly interrupts this dialectic which has been playing out in the previous context. Okay? Again, I'm what's called steel manning. I'm giving the steel man argument. Now, I'm trying to present each argument the best way I can, right? Without betraying which I line up with. So the primary argument is context in regards to that, right? The secondary argument is in regards to the language itself, the whole concept of sons and daughters, playing on that whole concept of seed or descendancy from these previous chapters, which is the context building up to it, right? The bearing of children, which obviously occurs in verse 4, right? So the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Those were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Like you get this continual men language, right? So the whole man-woman element. And then it couples that primarily with a reference, it's a very passing reference, but a reference in the Gospels where, in short, Christ says, he's making another point. I'm saying it is a passing reference because he's using it really as an addendum to a broader point he's making throughout the rest of the chapter. But in passing, he mentions that being like the angels who neither create nor procreate, right? Who do not bear children, or who neither given nor taken in marriage is the literal wording, right? In the Gospels in relation to angels, and so it's then summarized from that angels do not. This is actually where it touches on one of your questions. That angels are not actually capable of procreating, which would naturally therefore mean that the concept of the angelic view or the divine view, the angelic view, the watcher view of sons of God, meaning angels, then somehow procreating with daughters of men, meaning humans, is impossible. Okay? So it takes that statement of Christ in the Gospels, synthesizes it with Genesis 6 as a kind of deduction, right? A logical deduction. And so that the phrase here of men of renown, sons of God, it ties into the language of certain rabbinical writings from the centuries after Christ. It ties in with other language that's already used even in the intertestamental period. So intertestamental is between Malachi and Matthew, right? Which is exactly the context where First Enoch is written. Because we find, for example, that language that's otherwise used to describe the sons of God ends up being translated through Greek to be rulers and judges, which is a more human kind of language or way of referring to them. And so basically the distinction is, apart from the names, the angelic view is a more, as the name suggests, angelic view. The Sethite view is a human view, okay, of who these figures are. Right? And so the seminal sin there is that the righteous or the faithful line intermarrying with the unrighteous, okay? which contextually does make sense given what we've had in chapters 4 and 5, and the seed of the woman and the seed of the woman, the descendancy of Eve, faithful line, the seed of the serpent, the wicked line, the evil bloodline, right? And intermarrying between the two of them, of course, for very obvious reasons, being expressly forbidden by God, right? Faithful and unfaithful, that does not and cannot and should not mix, right? And so the mixing of these two lines is what then is the primary and particular problem. The third view, which is essentially a hybrid of these two views, gets called by different things by different scholars, so it doesn't really matter what we call it per se, but it's what can in shorthand be described as the God-King view. Okay, the God-King. This is taking elements of both and synthesizing them together, okay, in a way that's surprisingly harmonious, to be honest. The essential view is picking up on the core basis of the angelic view, which is that element that I discussed earlier, the ubiquitous elemental stories of divine progenitor and human progenitor producing great mighty warrior, king, god, or demigod, giant, blah, 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 right? In whatever form as the cultural story dictates, right? And that, however, what it's doing is taking on the view that the angels did not directly procreate with... So taking that basic view, synthesizing it with the point that the Sethite view holds, which is that procreation between angels and humans is impossible. Okay, because that is the staple view, like I mentioned, from that comment from the Lord in the Gospels, and deducing that it's not actually something that's possible by nature, right? Which is a complex metaphysical point. But anyway, I'll save that specifically for the Q&A. However, in much of a similar vein as the angelic view of, kind of looking as to what the rooted, embedded understanding of these things in the ancient world was, one thing which is also, again, ubiquitous and universal, is that the pagan understanding of kings was that they were gods. Okay? They were gods. They were treated as gods. They were understood to be gods. They were venerated, honoured, and worshipped as gods in absolutely no uncertain terms everywhere. Okay? For a variety of reasons. But even if, I could be here quite a while talking about this, but let's just use at least some examples to help you understand if you're not familiar with this. Let's talk about biblical examples. The pharaohs of Egypt. Okay? Were absolutely unequivocally understood to be gods in human form. Okay? Specifically, they were the medium and the embodiment of one particular god, Horus. Okay? The royal god. Egypt had a pantheon like any other pagan religion, right? So it had a whole pantheon, right? Pantheos, all gods, right? All the gods. Had a pantheon like any other place did, right? It's polytheistic because that's what paganism is. It's inherently polytheistic, multiple gods. But the pharaoh was the embodiment of Horus. He was the medium of Horus. Horus acted and lived in the world, in and through the king, or the pharaoh, as we call them, right? From Egyptian. That this passed down from father to son to father to son. Okay. It's embodied in all of the pharaonic insignia and regalia that we've ever discovered anywhere, and we've obviously discovered, particularly the British and those descended from them who discovered bomb loads since we conquered Egypt back in the days following the Napoleonic War. All the tombs, all the pyramids, all the steles, all the sarcophagi, all the various things we've ever discovered. They're so obviously portrayed this way. They are also portrayed, especially some of the older ones, as being gigantic because you see in the hieroglyphs, or more than just the hieroglyphs you see in the artistic works, human like courtesans who are yay tall, and then they're standing before the pharaoh who is yay tall.
Yeah.
Right. Now, part of that, again, this depends on There's a lot of interpretive work, and I'm saying to you, this is it's actually a really, really complex subject of history, right? Of how you then interpret that. So, for example, when I've looked at and seen firsthand some of these ancient Egyptian artifacts in person, where you see the pharaoh, like various others, like especially Ramses II, one of the greatest and most renowned of the pharaohs ever. From around the 12th century BC, late 13th century BC, 19th dynasty, when he is pictured as standing alongside the gods, right? He is the same height as the gods when he's pictured there. How we then interpret that can get interesting, but what specifically needs to be understood is that regardless of how that gets interpreted by historians or archaeologists or anyone else in between, is that what that clearly demonstrates is the Egyptians unequivocally viewed their kings as equal to the gods, right? That's beyond dispute. That's what I'm saying to you. As long as you understand that, regardless of any other nitty-gritty nuances that really are irrelevant to almost all of us. This is why, by the way, the 10th plague was what it was, okay? The 10th plague that befell Egypt was what? Death of the firstborn sons, okay? Now, in part, this is justice for the slaughter of the innocents that the prior pharaoh had committed, okay? Which is what results in Moses ending up in a basket in the Nile, which itself is an image of the flood, where Noah is saved through an ark made of wood through the waters, right? Moses is then treated that way by God in the exact same fashion, right? He is cast into the waters where he would otherwise die, in the sacred river, the Nile, right? So it's already a river that is possessed by divine evil powers, right? And is then saved through it, right? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, get back to the point. So it's justice for that. It's retribution for that, right? However, the critical element of the 10 plagues gets missed unless, quite frankly, unless ministers like myself do a good enough job of explaining it. Each one of the plagues is a direct assault and attack upon one of the Egyptian gods, okay? Because it's all covering different areas that different deities among the Egyptian pantheon are responsible for. So the Nile gets turned into blood, right? You then get the plague of locusts, which wipes out the harvest. You then get the sores and boils, which is a direct assault upon the god of healing. Like, it's all these various elements. The 10th and final, though, seems odd because it doesn't touch on any one of these natural elements. The first 9 plagues were all these natural elements, right? The Nile, the farms, the physical body, right? Healing, all that kind of stuff. It's all these natural elements until you then get a very specific one in the 10th, which is the death of a very specific type of person. It's not just firstborn children in general. It's not just children in general. It's not just this one person. It's a very specific category of the firstborn sons. Not even the definitive singular, the definite article reason as to why that occurs is because, of course, as that story progresses, what happens in the royal court? The son of the pharaoh dies. And what that's doing, keeping in mind that each of the plagues is a direct attack by God on one of the Egyptian gods, why is he then doing this in the 10th? Because the 10th is the final assault upon Horus. The Egyptian understanding, as I mentioned earlier, is that the kings are the embodiment of Horus. When one king dies, Horus then embodies his son, who becomes the new pharaoh. By killing the son of the king, God has severed that bloodline and has destroyed that successive line of God king in the Egyptian understanding of how this works. Right? It lines up very, very neatly with things which happen in the 18th dynasty, which I don't have time for today, although it's a very fascinating subject. Anyway, point being that it cuts off that view. Okay, as long as you understand the basic essence is that the ancient pagan kings were understood to be gods in their own right. Okay. Which is where the essence of again, all of them, Babylonian kings, again, they were the embodiment of Marduk, the king of the gods in Babylon, the great ziggurat of Babylon, the great pyramid of Babylon. The way that the new king would actually be formally enthroned and formally become the king is he would ascend the great ziggurat, which is a pyramid, a type of pyramidal structure. Pyramids represent mountains, by the way. They represent mountains, okay? Because the mountains are where the gods are. Right? So the pyramids of Giza, the pyramids of the Aztecs and the Mesoamericans, the pyramids of Babylon, the pyramids are in China, there are pyramids buried in China, there's pyramids all over the world. But the great ziggurat of Babylon, which is reflective of the Tower of Babel itself, is the way that the king would become king is he would ultimately, the final part of his coronation would be he would ascend up into the ziggurat, and the top chamber it was called the royal chamber. At the top of the ziggurat was actually a bedroom, okay, and he would then consummate with a temple virgin of Marduk, right? And through that process, because consummating with this priestess of Marduk would then inhabit and embody him, the new king of Babylon. Okay? So you're already seeing this concept of gods, humans, consummation, procreation, right? Blah, blah, blah. So the gods were literally the embodiment, the kings were literally the embodiment of usually the national god, or at least one of the most prominent of the gods, right? All over the place, okay? In one form or another, right? And so therefore the kings were understood to be gods in their own right. They were gods, okay? Etc., etc., etc. This is why in 1 Samuel chapter 8, this is at the tail end of the book of Judges, coming off the end of the book of Judges, the disaster and absolute dumpster fire that time period was for centuries. And the people in Samuel's day beckon God through Samuel, I should say, to give them a king like the nations. Okay. Now, the modern post-Enlightenment misunderstanding of that concept in the age of republicanism and democracy is that the sin there was that they asked for a king, but it's not what that sentence says. They asked for a king
instead of a democracy.
Yeah, they asked for a king like the nations, right? Like the nations is the operative part of that sentence. Okay, we want a great, mighty God king. Yeah, a demigod. Yeah, because we're looking around us and we have 5 people and a stray dog, and we only escaped the God king of Egypt by the skin of our teeth through nothing other than miraculous divine intervention in the first place. And now, here we are in the land of Canaan, surrounded by even more God kings. Do you know what I mean? And their armies, which are way bigger than us and have better tactics than us and are more powerful than us, better technology, weapons, blah, blah. We need a God king, is what they're effectively saying. Okay, that's what they get smited for, because God was to be king, and more importantly, the promised king was not to come yet. Right? Long story short, going back to sins that came from the tribe of Judah, or Judah himself really, the king was always going to come from Judah. There was always going to be a king and a royal line, a royal dynasty, which would end up eventuating ultimately in Christ himself, right? Which literally means king. However, due to things back in the book of Genesis, God delays it as a punishment for 10 generations, just like he did with the whole wandering in the wilderness for 40 days, right? They were sitting in the 9th generation, and they didn't want a king from Judah. They wanted a guy called Saul, who came from Benjamin. Wrong time, wrong tribe. And so God obliges them just to teach them a lesson, and of course then Saul happens, and it all goes down the toilet, and blah, 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 blah. And then you get the whole saga with David, and off it goes to 1 Samuel. You get the picture, right? And so that is building the basis for what gets called the tyrant king view, or the God king view, is that the angels did not directly consummate with human women. They, essentially what we could call possessed, they possessed mortal men, which is actually the view of exactly what the ancient pagan kings were anyway. So it's not like it's not wildly speculating on anything. It's taking something which was ubiquitous among the ancient pagan kings. They were the embodiment of the gods, right? And that those otherwise mortal men, possessed by a god, a demon, so they're demon possessed, then take human women, which is also actually exactly what the ancient kings did do, right? But in a very particular way too, and this is deeply, deeply important you understand. Again, without understanding the ancient world, it's totally understandable to miss this, right? From start to finish, the image of marriage is totally, ubiquitously monogamous. Okay? One man, one woman. Tying back to the creation, Adam and Eve, duh. But there's the consistent command all the way throughout. Okay? Any time that you see other variances, they are but variances of that. Okay? That God, through his mercy, oblige would be the wrong word, puts up with, so as to not completely crush. Otherwise God would be sending a flood every 5 minutes, right? Let's be honest. It's true, right? So examples like David, right? Abraham at certain points, like with Hagar, blah, blah. Solomon, right? Monogamy is the very clear picture. Contrary to every single other example throughout the pagan world among aristocracy in general, but really more importantly and specifically, the kings. Okay? The concept of monogamy among the kings was unheard of. They would have a queen, because you need a queen, you need a specific individual through whom the son, the rightful heir, the crown prince will come, no doubt. But then the king also has, to one degree or another, a harem of women. Okay? Ubiquitously, universally, without almost any single variance at all. Okay? Why is that at all pertinent, apart from the obvious connection to Genesis 6? It is because, in a really, really interesting symbolic way, polyamory, right, or polygamy to use the more specific term, right, as opposed to monogamy, monos meaning one, poly, many. Polygamy is directly equated with polytheism. Monogamy directly equated with monotheism, one God, right? For extremely obvious reasons, apart from the fact they literally have the same beginning and the same root that we have in the word in English, right? Polytheism, polygamy, monotheism, monogamy, right? It's directly treated that way very, very clearly all throughout, right? And so polygamy is directly equated with idolatry, which is why virtually every time that we see polygamy in the Old Testament, what also happens to feature in and around that story, if not directly linked to the story, idolatry, right? So Solomon, to use one chief example, starts adopting the customs of pagan kings and eventually has a harem of his own, a royal harem of multiple concubines, effectively, right? At the exact same time, and this is explicit identification, by the way, that occurs there in the story of Solomon, it's those women who then lead him into idolatry. Mm-hmm. It's not just that he starts practicing idolatry in general, although that would still be making the point. It's the very harem of women that he accumulates who directly lead him to start practicing pagan idolatry. Right? Solomon is the archetype of exactly what I'm talking about. Okay? Because Solomon had his prayer answered in a way that he wasn't anticipating. What was Solomon's fundamental prayer? What was his prayer to God at the very beginning? Do you recall? Brilliant, exactly. God said to him, ask of me and I'll give you anything that you want. He is asking a question, a very dangerous question to a mortal man. Very, very dangerous question. A question which any other king would have answered very differently. And has answered very differently, by the way, all right? Throughout history. Again, it's difficult to describe how elevated the ancient pagan kings were in people's eyes. It's functionally impossible. We don't really have... The only thing that would even come remotely close today is celebrities, sort of, and like sports stars, like athletes. But even then, it's not even close. That's a more pathetic version of what this was. At least in the ancient world, at least it was fairly straightforward. Why do we worship and honor this guy? Well, because he's literally a god in human form. Okay, fair enough. That makes sense, right? Right? Huh?
And told to.
Yeah, but it's more than just told to. It's more than just told to. Like the actual view of. See, no one literally views celebrities as gods in human form. So I'm saying it's a more pathetic version of what at least in the ancient world. The reason why they were doing what they're doing is because they were all in universal agreement that this is a god, right? So he could have answered anything, but what does Solomon ask for? He asked for wisdom. Now God ultimately fulfills that because Solomon reaches the height of heights. He becomes the most powerful king in the ancient world at his height, right? He's more powerful and influential than the pharaohs of Egypt, than the kings of Babylon or the early kings of Babylon, the kings of Assyria, anyone else, right? His royal court is the most sought after royal court in the ancient Near Eastern world, basically 1,000 years before Christ, right? He, and by extension they, the Israelites, are on top of the world, until he then begins his downward spiral and the greatest fall off of any king maybe ever, right? Hundreds of concubines. I mean, it depends on how literally you interpret the 700 and 300. You can interpret them literally. They're also pretty symbolic numbers, but that doesn't matter. Either way, hundreds of concubines, pagan, like idolatrous worship, riches beyond imagination, boom, 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 all the things he was told not to do, he starts doing, blah, 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 until he reaches the absolute pit of human existence. And he then writes a nice little children's book called Ecclesiastes. Which makes for good bedtime reading. And long story short, and that's of course where we get the famous saying of vanity, life is but vanity. And he doesn't even refer to himself. He calls himself the preacher. So it's a very demure, humble title that is given there. And what is the conclusion of Ecclesiastes? Fear God. Fear God. Fear the Lord, or you'll perish. That's literally the conclusion of Ecclesiastes. It's quite literally how the book ends, right? Hence why the wisdom literature elsewhere says that what is the beginning of knowledge? Wisdom, right? And vice versa, right? Knowledge and fear specifically. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, which elsewhere is rendered as wisdom, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay. So fearing God is the beginning of all knowledge and the beginning of all wisdom that comes from that knowledge, right? That's basically so then Solomon does end up actually, God answers Solomon's prayer and Solomon does become the wisest man who ever lived because he reached a height that very few men in the history of the world have ever reached. And the men that reach that height, their name is equally remembered in history. We call them Alexander the Great, we call them Julius Caesar, we call them Napoleon, we call them a couple of dozen other people, right? Across different cultures around the world, right? Their names are still known in history. It's difficult. None of us have any ability at all to even understand what a life like that would look like. Yet who also, from that height of human existence, crashed and free fell into an abyss that also very few men have ever actually descended into, right? And so he learns everything of the extremes of human life and becomes wise in that way, right? This image of the God King or the Tyrant King, different ways it gets called, but the God King is something which is actually very, very true in the ancient world, right? So, this might seem like a lengthy discussion we've had here, but please do understand this is an incredible synopsis and short explanation of what is a very complex subject. These are three views. Angelic view, or the Watcher view, same thing. The angelic view, Sethite view, God King view. Okay? Now, there are different points throughout history over the last 2,000 years, let's just at least narrow it down to that point, as to how this has been understood. Okay? The early church has all three. It has two in predominance at two different times to two different degrees. The other one kind of floats around that. Right? The earliest view of certainly the first 300 years is almost exclusively the angelic view. Okay? So in other words, it's very clearly continuing on the general status quo view of the Hellenistic period. Okay, so in other words, the intertestamental period, the couple of centuries prior to Christ. Right? Because that is the view of first Enoch. The first Enoch is unequivocally clear as to what its view is. It's literally the source of the angelic view, at least in terms of extra biblical writings. Right?
Would that be influenced though by the culture? Because that was the norm.
Well, of course it is. All the above. Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, first Enoch. Yes. First Enoch. It's kind of like it's like when you have a popular movie in the modern age, or a popular TV show, or a popular game, or something, and then people write fan fiction as a result. It's not there's the movie, and then there's other stories which other authors or independent filmmakers make as like a variation upon that. Like there's a main. I'm just going to use something silly here, but like let's just say there's the main. There's the kind of there's the blockbuster. Batman movies throughout history, right, for the last 50 years. And then there's 1,000 other independent videos and little independent studios that make little stories. And that's basically what First Enoch is. It's like a folk tale version of Genesis 6:1-4, if that makes any sense at all. It's difficult to try and... That's my best encapsulation of it, right? Yes?
Does this mean they believe that the angels procreated with the
human women? Yes. Yes. That's the essence of that angelic view, and that's pretty much ubiquitously and universally the view of at least the writings that we have in existence, or we call the extant views of the first 300 years. So it's extremely clearly the view of Saint Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, Saint Athenagoras of Athens in the 2nd century, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century. So these are huge names. These are literally these are the most prominent church fathers of the 2nd century, some of whom are only 2 steps removed from the apostles. I mean, Saint Irenaeus is taught by Polycarp. Polycarp is taught by John. So it's very direct, right? Again, first 300 years, there's plenty of others as well. Tertullian, St. Clement of Alexandria. There's a variety of figures in the first 300 years who all in the first 300 years of the extant writings we have, you cannot find really another view other than the angelic view. Okay, in other words, basically the view of first Enoch, in general terms at least, is the view of the first 300 years. Okay, it's difficult to say that otherwise. You get, like I said, I'm saying ubiquitous and virtually universal is the best way of describing it. Now, part of that, to be fair, it's always a balance when it comes from someone who studies history, is to be taken with an element of balance. So, for example, we are assuming that from the writings that we have in existence. Now, we know there are writings that we know of prominent church figures from the early church whose writings we no longer have. So, like for example, when we in our church history course, in our church history course, the first portion of the early church, right, basically from the apostles to Augustine, we looked at the apostolic fathers. So, in other words, those directly taught by the apostles. Okay, personally knew them personally. We only looked specifically at Saint Clement of Rome, Saint Ignatius of Antioch. Okay, because they are the ones whose writings are extant that we actually have. So we have there's 7 letters from Saint Ignatius of Antioch, right? There is a letter called First Clement. There's also technically a Second Clement, but there's at least First Clement that we looked at from Clement of Rome. Basically, there's a great crisis in the Church of Corinth. The young men kick out their entire eldership and revolt against the church and take over. And so Clement, who's one of the bishops of Rome, one of the leaders of the Church of Rome, writes a letter from Rome to Corinth telling them to fix it. Yeah, in as many words. So we have those writings. However, other figures like Saint Papias, who's from that time period and who's directly an apostolic father taught by John, we don't have any of his writings. We can tell that he did write something because we get vague references to other things from later early church fathers referring back to it, but we don't have it, so we have no idea what it is. So, do you know what I mean? So, in part, you are taking from what are the extant writings of these historical figures. Okay, so theoretically, it's possible that there was a mixture of another view other than that. However, that starts to play a very dangerous game of what if, because you're just basically speculating upon, well, what if there were writings that it's like, well, you could say about anything, right? In the first 200 years, there really is no other view other than the angelic view. However, on the flip side of that, when you get to the 4th and 5th centuries, which has the greatest volume of writing, right? So the writings, you don't even need to get the 5th. The writings of the 4th century alone, there are more writings from the 4th century than the first 300 years combined. Okay, right? So we have more from the 4th. Now that's during the Great Arian Crisis. It's during the first 2 ecumenical councils. God is raised as many heretics as there are popping up left, right, and centre in Arianism. That God is raising up even more great church fathers, St. Athanasius of Alexandria, his predecessor Alexander of Alexandria, great name, the Cappadocian fathers, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, all these kinds of figures which come along, right? We have more writings from them than the first 300 years combined, and that's before you then tack on the 5th century, which includes even greater titans of the faith, like St. Ambrose of Milan, St. John Chrysostom, Bishop in Antioch, then Archbishop of Constantinople, St. Augustine of Hippo, of course, right? Who are themselves the 2 most prolific writers of the early church, St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine. We have more from them from anyone else. And interestingly, the view in the 4th and 5th century is almost exclusively the Sethite view. So there is a bit of a blend between the 2 in the early 4th century, but then by the time of the mid to late 4th century, and then definitely in the 5th, the view is almost entirely Sethite. Not literally all, but almost entirely Sethite. And so then in the Middle Ages, the view, again, pretty much exclusively throughout the Middle Ages for 1,000 years, is the Sethite view, because the entirety of Western philosophy, I'm being exaggerating, virtually almost the entirety of Western philosophy and theology comes in through and by St. Augustine of Hippo, right? So St. Augustine, that's why even secular historians will usually say that St. Augustine of Hippo is the most influential philosopher in the history of the Western canon, okay? Because Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle get preserved and taught and understood and interpreted through St. Augustine, and then everyone after St. Augustine is reading through the lens of St. Augustine. Right? So his influence is literally unparalleled. He has a work Civitas Dei, the city of God, which is his magnum opus. He's living through the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and he understands that he needs to write a work to help his fellow Romans be able, and specifically Roman Christians, be able to process why the world is ending.
Yes.
Right? Because as far as they're concerned, and everyone's concerned, the world is ending because Rome's collapsing. The eternal city, for starters, just got overrun and sacked by the Goths in 410, which was the first time in literally 800 years that a foreign army had stepped foot in Rome. The last time a barbarian army ever stepped foot in Rome was 390 BC, with the Gallic sacking of Rome. Fast forward to 410, literally 800 years to the year, and Rome is sacked once again by the barbarians from the north. Except that time it was the beginning of the end. Yeah. And so all these things, as he writes, the city of God, which contrasts the city of man, earthly kingdoms. He's picking up on images from Daniel, the successive kingdoms, Babylon, Syria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, which would then be succeeded by a final kingdom, not made of various elements like gold and silver and bronze and iron, but of rock of the earth. And it would smash that statue from Daniel's visions in chapter 2 and elsewhere and grow into a giant mountain which would fill the whole earth. And it's eternal. It would not be succeeded by another kingdom. It's the kingdom of heaven, right? Us. Blah, blah, blah. In that work specifically, which is I'm saying that is his greatest work, right, of his many great works, in the city of God, he explicitly identifies the city of man with the daughters of men from Genesis 6 and the city of God with the sons of God from Genesis 6, which is the clearest detailing of the Sethite view you could ever have, right? And so
So what's that view?
So the one that we mentioned, the ones descended from Seth. That is the ones who are being referred to as sons of God in Genesis 6, right? So they're not angels, but they're humans, right? And that the sin there that was occurring was that the faithful Christian line of descendants, that bloodline of Seth, was intermarrying with the wicked, unfaithful bloodline of Cain, okay? And so that gets, again, so there's some huge figures from that time period that hold to that Sethite view. Some of them are literal heroes to me, right? So St. Athanasius the Great holds the Sethite view. St. John Chrysostom holds the Sethite view. St. Augustine holds the Sethite view. St. Ambrose holds the Sethite view. Like, it's huge writers from the early church, right? Hold to the Sethite view. So in the early church, you have both of them held by equally significant and authoritative and intellectually brilliant figures, right? You've got on one side figures like I mentioned earlier, Saint Justin Martyr, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, Saint Clement of Alexandria, right, et al. And on the other side, Saint Athanasius the Great, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Ambrose, Saint Augustine. It's like, yeah. It then becomes the predominant view throughout the Middle Ages in the West, because in the Latin West, Augustine becomes the bedrock of Western theology, right? And rightly so, right? And that's not even a problem, but rightly so. So throughout the Middle Ages, certainly in the West, even predominantly in the East, the Sethite view is the view. In the Reformation, that continues. Okay, so the Reformers overwhelmingly, almost exclusively hold the Sethite view. Okay, so it depends on how we're judging this. If you're talking about it from a historical perspective, which view has the longer amount of time, you would probably technically land on the Sethite view, because basically the Sethite view has been consistently held for about, again, I'm talking the majority sense here, almost exclusively in certain places, for basically at the tops 1700 years. It's a long time. However, it's nigh impossible to argue It's not literally impossible, but it is not. It's very, very difficult to argue that it is the earliest view. It's not impossible. I'm trying to be fair, but it is difficult because the angelic view is very, very clearly the view of the intertestamental period. It's very clearly the view of the first 300-ish plus or minus years of the church in the New Testament, that is to say, the New Covenant. And when you look at Jude, right, where he's explicitly referencing first Enoch, which is the foundation of this concept in the first place, broadly speaking at least, in terms of extra biblical writings, what does he say in verse 6? The angels who did not keep their own domain. Now, if I want to get real finicky, in a technical sense, angelos, angel, which literally translated the Greek word angelos into English, angel, in a technical sense, literarily or semantically, means messenger, which is why the angels are called as such. Because, of course, what do? 99% of the time, they're sending a message. Right? They're giving a message to someone, right? It's the Archangel Gabriel at the Annunciation, right? So literally announcing the conception of the Messiah to the Virgin Mary, right? Blah, 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 right? They're messengers, okay? So that's why in Greek, in the Bible in Greek, they are referred to as such, okay? There are clearly different types of these beings, but they get encapsulated in this simplified, all-encompassing term of angelos, right, or angeloi, plural angels. Right? However, there are a handful of instances where angelos is used to refer to humans in the New Testament. There is a couple. Paul at one point is referred to as such, right, as a messenger. Well, we translate it messenger. We don't translate it angel in English. We translate it messenger. But the word that's actually being used is angelos. Okay. The clergy or the ministers of the church at one point, or 2 points actually, are referred to as angelos. Okay. One of them mainly in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. Okay, where it's a perfectly legitimate interpretation to hold that the angel of the church of Smyrna, the angel of the church of Philadelphia, the angel is a reference to its bishop, to its minister, right? Because the bishops / elders / whatever we're using that term for in English, the clergy of that church are the messenger of God, literally, right? In the sense that when they proclaim the scriptures, just like I'm doing here, they become functionally the mouthpiece of God, right? They're not God, but they're the mouthpiece of God, just like the prophets were, right? However, that's not at all what this is talking about. It's astonishingly clear what verse 6 is saying, right? It's very clearly not referring to human messengers, okay? We know exactly what this is referring to. It's referring to first Enoch directly. Literally no one disagrees on that in scholarship, right? The angels who did not keep their own domain, heaven, but abandoned their proper abode, he has then kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. That's talking about the imprisonment of those in Tartarus, okay? Right? And that's why, so that's where, again, this is playing into a deeper subject of who the Nephilim are. If we wanted to get really technical, what we call devils or demons in modern English semantics is but the spirits of those Nephilim. That's a much more complex subject in Christian theology that requires looking at some certain texts and diving and connecting dots and blah blah. Even where we get the English word demon is taken from the Greek daemon, which just is a generic word for God, lowercase g, right? A deity, right? Because as the Bible explicitly explains, the gods of the nations are demons. Okay, right? Old and New Testament says that. Every single early church father explains that very clearly. This pantheon of gods that are worshipped, they are demons. Okay? Blah, blah, blah. So, that's probably the best place to hop off on verse 6, because without anything more I can explain in the specific question which literally relates to this, in the Q&A if you're interested. And I'll probably save where I personally sit on it for that, because it's a bit easy to explain it if I've touched on that stuff, which I'm saving for that Q&A, or sorry, which is more appropriate for that Q&A section, right? I could just say it here, but we could keep going further. And I'll save it for that. It's more appropriate there, right? Either way, more importantly, no matter what we're taking on this, right? Now that we've at least got a hopefully basic understanding of what these understandings are. What is the point of him including this as an example? The unrighteous, through sexual corruption, right, then has resulted in judgment, right? The angels, who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day, right? He has imprisoned those sons of God, those fallen ones, in Tartaros, in hell, okay? That's just basic stock standard, regardless of any of this other stuff anyway, right? And so then thirdly and finally, verse 7 is the third example of this first triad. So verse 7 of Jude. So let's look over to Jude now. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, having indulged in the same way as these in gross immorality, the these in reference is referencing back to the angels of verse 6, right? And having gone after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Okay, so what's it's referring to? It's referring to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? Sodom and Gomorrah were what we call twin cities. So twin cities is where you have two major cities side by side. We don't really have twin cities here per se. I mean, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast and Brisbane and Gold Coast sort of kind of function that way to a degree, but not really. Yeah, or Wodonga might be an example of a small town, I suppose. Yeah, the twin towns you could do. That'd be a good way of thinking of it. Yeah, I was more thinking of the big cities. But yeah, Wodonga would be a good one for smaller towns like that. But twin cities around the world are things which have developed in different places. St. Paul, Minneapolis in the US state of Minnesota is an example. Anyway, the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were very prominent, of course. Obviously, they had other smaller satellite towns or cities, what we really call towns these days, around them, right? They were cities consumed with vice and sin, godless places, very clearly, but very prominent, well-known cities nonetheless. This is following on through things in Genesis. You could go read it of your own accord, but long story short, Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham, ends up in Sodom specifically. And there he's dwelling with his family. Things are going, of course, massively awry. Lot needs to be saved from the city. God's going to judge the city and destroy it for very obvious reasons based on how evil places like Sodom and Gomorrah were, and the fact that their continued existence upon the earth would only further poison the very nature of humanity and the world around it, which is true. There are times in humans that one of the great lessons of Sodom and Gomorrah, just a very brief aside, is that it helps people who are too consumed, and this is me being a bit cynical, but too consumed with being nice and pedantic, that there are simply times in life when cancer has to be cut out, when weeds have to be uprooted, and when things that are so consumed with evil cannot be allowed to continue, literally for the sake of the earth and for the world, like for the sake of humanity, right? There are various different times, like when Rome conquered Carthage. Right? Cato the Elder, one of the great statesmen and senators of that time, would have a speech that would, be talking in the Senate. They could be talking about budgetary things. They could be talking about, taxes for the temple. They could be talking about any other thing. And he would end his speeches in the late 3rd century every single time with a phrase, no matter what subject they were talking about, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Because even the ancient pagan Romans understood that an entire empire spanning much of the coastal Mediterranean that was literally and figuratively built from the ground up upon child sacrifice, because Carthaginians were Phoenicians, so in other words, northern Canaanites. They committed child sacrifice to Moloch, right? Because they're related, they're Canaanites. They're directly related to the people that we see in the Bible, right? And so their whole civilization was built upon child sacrifice, right? Even the pagan Romans understood that a civilization like that, for the sake of the world, cannot be allowed to continue. Right? And so they annihilated it, and they wiped Carthage from the face of the earth in what we call the Punic Wars. Sodom and Gomorrah is an ancient, much more ancient example of just that. As a Canaanite city, ultimately, God brings judgment and destroys the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And even the land around where ancient Sodom and Gomorrah were bear the marks of it. There are literal balls of sulfuric, encrusted sulfuric acid and mass that have been found in archaeological digs in and around the ancient sites of Sodom and Gomorrah. So there is concrete archaeological evidence of the raining down of sulfur and fire from the heavens in archaeological digs around Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, the sexual immorality that's being referenced after strange flesh, in other words, literally different flesh, is referring to the rampant homosexuality of the men of Sodom, which is exactly why in English we call that sin sodomy, right? Sodomites, meaning a man of Sodom, right? And so they want to. Of course, you then have the angels. God sends angels, two off memory, if I recall correctly. Anyway, sends angels to rescue Lot and his family from the city. They are surrounded very quickly in their house by many of the men of Sodom, who seek to rape and abuse them. And the story kind of folds up from there, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, the angels turn all of them blind, fight them on the way out. They then rescue them. Lot's wife is turned to a pillar of salt as judgment for her sins. And again, it's not a trivial thing what she does there. The reason why she turns back to look at Sodom is because she wants to go back to Sodom. That's why. Anyway, long story short, blah blah blah. Things play out there. It's not really a great story. The best thing that happens is that Abraham's nephew is rescued by God, despite not deserving it really, by one scintilla. Lot, at least not the rest of his family, certainly not his wife. There's the whole affair of what his daughters do afterwards, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, that's what's being referenced here, right? The Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities around them, having indulged in the same way, in other words, referring back to these angels who did not keep their own domain, right? As these engross sexual immorality and having gone after strange flesh, right? Are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire, because Sodom and Gomorrah were literally wiped off the face of the earth. Right? Never to be rebuilt, never to be re-inhabited ever again. Right? So entire ancestral lines, bloodlines that ran from Adam down to random Joe Schmo sitting there in Sodom, gone as judgment. Because it needed to be. Anyone who doesn't, and this is just a very brief aside as well, when it comes to the more seemingly macabre elements of the Bible, like the conquest of Canaan or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or insert what you want, the natural temptation that arises from the emotional side of our being, as well as the thing that has always been accused of Christians at one point or another, especially in the modern age, of these being brutal, barbaric, horrific things in the Bible, and how could a loving God possibly do this, and blah, 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 rubbish, comes from, and I'm trying not to be insulting unnecessarily, but it comes from the most profound and astonishing ignorance of history. It comes from an absolute plague of more than ignorance, because that's really just what I mentioned, but it comes from an absolute plague of naivety, especially from a moral perspective, right, as to how the world has operated throughout history, as to what has usually actually been required to ensure that you survived more than 5 minutes in this world, and also comes from a complete general hubris, especially from a moral perspective, right? The reason why the modern atheist or just agnostic or whatever they happen to refer to themselves as thinks of themselves as being morally good is because they are standing on an unparalleled bastion of civilization and morality built exclusively by Christianity over the course of 2,000 years. Okay? They have inherited a raging river of blessings from thousands of years of Christian civilization, Christendom, that has built itself up to the point that by the time they're born, even amidst such a godless and apostate age as ours, the general inertia and momentum of all that doesn't just magically evaporate and disappear in 5 minutes, right? And so all the things that we have, especially in a place like this, where we are not being invaded by pagan barbarians every 5 minutes, where we are not fighting against, we're not at war on the fringes of our kingdom or our nation against people who chop off heads and who are cannibals and who use rape as a weapon of warfare and who kill their own children to make sure that the sun rises the next day and blah, 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 blah. Like all these things which have been driven out and destroyed by Christianity, rightfully so, including in this land, by the way, as well. Again, no one born now, especially not if they go through these assembly lines of propaganda, which we call public schools, will have any meaningful concept of the fact that cannibalism was almost ubiquitous in the top end and in the Gulf of Carpentaria. No understanding of that. No understanding of the fact that many of the Aboriginal tribes up in the top end were cannibals. The fact that throughout many of the tribes all across the land, here in the southeast, in the central deserts, across the Nullarbor, all the way up into the Kimberley, blah, blah, the concept of rape there was no category for what we call rape, right? As in forced sex, as in non-consensual, to use that modern term, right? There was no concept of rape as a category, right? Because women were but an object of flesh that was able to be used to fulfill sexual desire at will at any point by anyone, including family, right? So all these concepts, there's no concept at all as to what even this continent was like until, quite frankly, our Britannic ancestors brought the light of Christian civilization to it, right? These ridiculous smoking ceremonies that people are forced to participate in have no meaningful understanding that the explicit purpose of that is to ensure that none of the spirits of your ancestors who may be angry or otherwise untoward against you can hinder what is going on with you and in and around you. And so the smoke is meant to cleanse your spirit of any unwanted attaches to angered ancestral spirits and blah, 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 blah. All these kinds of things.
To appease spirits.
Yes, it's appease, yes, it's all used to appease it, yes, exactly. And so all these kinds of things, right? When you live in a world that has defeated the lion's share of all of those things, it becomes very easy to forget what the world was like, is my point, right? Very, very easy. And so the entire point here, perhaps the single most important word that is used in any of the things that we've looked at here is in that last sentence, and it is the word which hopefully in English for you is translated example. Right? They are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Okay? His whole purpose for giving this discourse of verses 5 to 19, and he's begun here in the first 3 verses with the first triad of examples, is just that, examples. He is giving completely well-known examples from biblical and non-biblical stories and accounts that the people here culturally 2,000 years ago were completely familiar with from childhood, to remind them. That's why he says again at the beginning of verse 5, to remind you, right? Now I want to remind you, though you know all things. So he's saying, I know that you know these stories, that's why I'm going to remind you of them, right? Because blah, 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 are an example of undergoing the punishment of eternal fire, right? So he's giving this first triad of rebellion bringing about destruction, i.e. punishment, or judgment, same thing, right? So judgment / punishment / justice, in that sense, right? Rebellion equals judgment, right? These are the three examples. The rebellious Exodus generation, the angels who did not keep their own domain, Sodom and Gomorrah. He's going to then, in verses 8 through 10, which will be our next lesson, gives a kind of asterisk fourth bonus example from the Testament of Moses, another extra biblical story, right? But we'll cover that in the next lesson, all right?